In an ideal world, obviously, we wouldn't need a Women's History Day, month, whatever. But the fact is, there is still a certain amount of inequality. I mean, forgive me, even perhaps Aspect's own output.
No one wants a protagonist with no agency. It's so hard then to write a compelling story that will be a page turner. So you have to find a way to sort of sneakily give them agency without betraying the
Mm.
historical story too much.
Agency, or at least a voice.
Hello. During March, we've had Women's History Month, and in that vein, I invited two Aspects of History authors on to discuss. Sarah Gristwood is a historian and editor of the recent Secret Voices, a collection of women's diaries, and Miranda Malins is a novelist and historian and is currently writing a non-fiction book on the Cromwell dynasty. We discuss whether we need Women's History Months and the challenges facing women in history and women writing history. Aspects of History has produced an anthology of female writing, Her Story, which is available in the show notes. And throughout March, our Substack has featured many women historians and fiction writers. So without further ado, this is me talking with Sarah and Miranda on women's history. Welcome, Miranda Malins, Sarah Gristwood, to the podcast. Thank you very much for joining me both.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Sorry, I should have.
Yes, I know. Warned us to be polite, yeah.
Yeah. Right. Now we're here to talk, because Aspects of History is well-known feminist outpost, obsessed with everything to do with women. So, in that vein, we've published a new book. Sarah, not sure how aware you are of this, but you're in
Yes,
it.
yes, I am indeed. Yes.
Great.
No, I.
Great. And Miranda very kindly wrote the introduction, and the title is Her Story.
Uh-huh.
I didn't actually choose that. Someone the three of us know did. But are we
Hey,
happy with the title?
that's a disclaimer up front. I love that.
Yes, I know it is, isn't it? Yes, I know. It's like when I approach people with the dog, saying he's very friendly.
Exactly. Right. So, and this is because it was published on International Women's Day,
Hmm.
which I'm sure everyone listening knows. But to remind them, it's the 8th of March. But I think it's International Women's Month.
It is.
Um,
Yes.
and so History Month. And so I wanted, or is it? It's just International Women's Month, actually, isn't it? And so I wanted to speak to you both, but to get your thoughts on women's history in March 2025. And so, Miranda, maybe I could kick off with you, since you so kindly wrote that introduction. Is it a good idea to have a Women's History Month in the first place? Do we think that's a good thing?
Oh, well, I guess what I'd say first of all is that this volume is very exciting. And I think that the volume speaks for the fact that women's history is in a really good place, women's writing in 2025, I would say. Also, the fact that we now have a women's prize for non-fiction as of last year, which
Hmm.
is a nice step forward. And there are so many wonderful female authors writing, and many of them for aspects of history. In terms of the women's history or women's International Women's Month or Day, in general, I'm always a bit wary of overplaying these things and having things for a whole month, and just because I always feel that it slightly smacks of the fact that we need that helping hand, and that whereas actually for all of those women, either women writing about the past or people writing about women in the past, we're all doing it every day. So every day, every month for us is International Women's Day or Women's Month. But that's perhaps being overly sort of cautious and pessimistic. Obviously, anything that brings people to this area and gets them interested in it is can only be a good thing.
Oh, good. That's nice to hear. Okay, Sarah. And
I
actually,
think.
we should remind listeners your book, Secret Voices, which goes through every day of the year. I wonder what the entry is on for the 8th of March, actually. But anyway, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. My wife was telling me,
Thank
because I gave her a copy and she absolutely loves it. This is Women's Voices Throughout the Year, but what do you think about the whole entity of the...
Women's History
Yeah.
Day, month, treated as a special case. I guess it's like growing old. It sucks until you think of the alternative. In an ideal world, obviously, we wouldn't need a Women's History Day, month, whatever. But the fact is, there is still a certain amount of inequality. I mean, forgive me, even perhaps Aspect's own output, like so many others. Just you've got so many wonderful military and, on the whole, male historians that yeah, I have a bit of a groan and a sigh when I think, oh, International Women's History Day. What happened to the other 364 in the year? But I think there probably is still a case for it.
Right. Well, I think you're absolutely right. Do you think history is it's just male dominated generally then?
No, I think that's a bit too simplistic. I think there's been huge advances in the course of, well, our lifetimes, even our writing careers, or my writing career. But there was such a long way to make up that I think there is still some work to be done. I mean, I was struck when you mentioned Secret Voices, when I was setting about compiling material, editing that anthology. Obviously, I looked at other anthologies of diarists. The three big ones were done as recently, comparatively recently, as I think the 1990s, turn of the century, and the proportion of women in there was minute, nothing remotely resembling 50-50, even though diaries have been in many ways a woman's form.
Mm. And Miranda, you've written two novels, Puritan Princess and Rebel Daughter. Now they came out, what was it, Puritan Princess in 2021?
Yes, 2020 for the first one, and then a year or two later for the second one. Yeah.
So you're relatively new to the sort of history and historical writing game, and you're writing your non-fiction book on the Cromwell dynasty. But so do you feel like, you're entering into a whole world of the grounds being laid by female historians previously, and you find it quite easy to do? I don't know.
It's a real mixture. So my academic background is in Civil War history, so 1640s, 1650s, and that's traditionally been a very male, very, very male corner of historical writing. And even today, there are more of us, more women writing in the field, which is great. But we're still vastly outnumbered by men probably at this stage writing in the field. But I also felt, I guess, when I was an apprentice in that field, and I was doing a PhD, and I was learning from a lot of wonderful male authors. When I realized that actually there were women in the story that weren't really being written about, in this case, the women in Cromwell's family, that was really exciting to me. And I thought, oh, okay, well, maybe I should be pulling them out and sort of rounding out this story, adding these amazing female stories from that period back into the narrative. And that's not to the exclusion of writing about men. As you say, my non-fiction book I'm writing now has two mega stars in it who are both male, Thomas Cromwell and Oliver Cromwell. So I see it very much as rounding out a picture rather than writing about women, rather than writing about men. But in terms of the two novels that I wrote, I actually used the novel form rather than history writing for those, because it's so hard often to access enough historical material about women. They're so marginalized in the footnotes and in the corners, in the edges of the historical record, that then you risk, if you are trying to write straight, non-fiction about them, narrative non-fiction, you can get really sort of stymied and hobbled by that. And it's always a bit of a risk of writing a book where you say, well, we think they thought this, or you have to have men constantly bringing them news because they don't know what's going on. So yeah, these fiction you can play, you can be more playful, you can put them in places, you can use them in the foreground, which is my excuse for dipping into the novel form for a couple of books.
Yes, in a sense, I'd second a lot of what Miranda was saying about non-fiction history. I mean, we don't need to just blame the historians or the publishers of history. A lot of it is about history as it's come down to us and the historical records. I mean, inevitably, a lot of history has been written about the people who won important battles, or won or lost, who passed laws, and those were very largely men. And that has coloured the records. You know, it's the records are the battles fought, the laws passed, the books written, but until comparatively recently, you know, in terms of the centuries, even that was very largely male. So, in a sense, historians of the past, you know, we needn't kind of hang them up and bastinado them. They were working with what they had.
I agree with that. And also, there can be a sense, can't there, Sarah, where you're trawling through the past and you're fishing, you're looking for these women to put them back in. But then equally, you don't want to bend over backwards so far in that
No, that's right.
that you then write and present an unbalanced account
Yes,
yourself.
I
So it's
know.
always a balancing act, isn't it?
No, I think it is a trap for us, for women writing about women, to try and make it justify ourselves, justify them by saying they had more influence than in fact they did. I mean, we'd like to think that women of the past had a lot more influence than has been recognised, often in private, unrecorded ways, but nonetheless, there is a trap for saying that this person, you know, virtually won the war when in fact that wasn't realistically the case. Then of course there's the whole question of what is important about the past. That's something that came up again with the diaries book. Is it women or men writing, recording their part in the great events? Or do the little daily things matter as much in the end when we can find out about them?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Because I'm always quite interested in sort of the bigger picture and things like that.
Mm,
Which I guess inevitably means I'm going to be, when looking at the past, looking at a lot of male heavy
mm-hmm.
stuff. And if you actually, you're quite right to pick aspects of history up. If you look at our, certainly the podcast list and the list of authors who are on the platforms, the vast majority are men. But that's not because we haven't approached women. It's just I think male historians have been more keen to get on board.
Right.
I don't know why that is though.
But then also we get into very interesting territory, don't we, Ollie, about bits of history and topics within history and what kind of readership they attract and what kind
Mm,
of authors they attract.
yes.
If your readers are wanting more, for instance, Second World War history books, military
Yes.
books, and those are predominantly, for whatever reason, and we can debate this, attractive as subjects for male historians, not always, but often, you need to give your readers what they want as well. So
Yeah.
again, it's
Yes.
a lot of there's a lot of causality to unpick there, isn't it?
Yes. No, that's interesting because I do think in many ways the writing of history, actually particularly non-fiction, fictional history, is quite gendered. As you say, in a sense, aspects of history has this fantastic list of military historians, military history books. And so, in a sense, you have to and a right to roll with that. And as you've just said, yes, perhaps traditionally that has been more male historians, maybe male history readers. By the same token, do biographies of women attract as many male readers? And if so, in a sense, we can't really fight that or lament it. We have to, I guess, the ideal thing would be there you are, set up a aspect two, set up a what's the equivalent of her story and history? What's aspects in it with a female? No, faspect really doesn't work. Um, you know, that's where perhaps, yes, female readers would go to look for material.
You're absolutely right, Sarah, and it's a perennial problem, isn't it? Also in fiction, well, maybe particularly in fiction, that it's quite well documented that men
Mm,
men like to buy books by male authors, women buy
yes,
books by either author.
yeah.
So as a female author, I can give you a specific example. When I was first starting out writing these novels, and I was talking in theory with my agent about writing some historical crime, which was all the rage at the time. His view was that I would need to not use my full
Mm,
name, but use initials, so that it
yes,
was clear that I was a woman
yeah,
writer, so that
yes,
male fans of historical crime fiction, of which there are many, would read my book. And
yes.
I found that really quite challenging as a concept.
No, indeed, but I know at least one other writer who does do it. And then, of course, when they get a piece of historical fiction by and about a woman, they tend to make the cover a figure with her head cut off, dressed in pink. Anyway.
Absolutely, and they like to emphasize the romantic element, don't they, and make it seem more of a
Yes,
sort of feminine book. But
yeah,
you know, we're getting into the territory, aren't we, of publishing and marketing, and
yes,
that can
certainly.
skew,
Yeah,
and genre fiction can be pushed
mm,
into cubby holes because it's helpful for
yeah. I,
marketing.
yeah. I mean, perhaps not the least of Hilary Mantel's achievement was that with the Wolf Hall trilogy, she broke through that. I mean, a number of her earlier historical novels were, to a certain degree, about women. Guess what? It was Wolf Hall that broke through.
That's true. The male subject matter. Yeah, that's true.
Was there a confusion? I'm sure not, but Hillary can be a male name as well. That wouldn't have had anything to do with it, would it?
I think everyone knew that probably
Yeah.
that she
Yeah,
was a
by then
girl,
she was
but
a
but
best-selling author,
nonetheless,
wasn't she?
this was a book that wasn't being pitched as for the girls, basically.
No, I remember the hardback cover of Wolf Hall was very striking, but yeah, it didn't have any of this sort of you get a lot of
No, it
flowers
didn't.
on the
No,
front covers, don't
exactly that. Well, I guess with Oliver Cromwell, you wouldn't probably. I mean, forgive me, Thomas, a Freudian slip. Thomas Cromwell, or indeed Oliver, you wouldn't, would you? I guess.
No.
But a lot of us female authors, women authors, would like that sort of gender neutral treatment,
Yeah. Yes.
wouldn't we? And you know, coming back to our anthology, I mean, I was interested when I was, you know, reading through it when I was preparing the introduction, that obviously there are a lot of women writers in there writing about women, but there are also a lot of women writers just writing, just
Yeah.
writing history, writing about men, writing about politics,
Mhm.
writing about religion, writing about culture, writing about anything. So it's again, we come back to this balancing act, this tightrope all the time, don't we? Where we don't want special treatment. But we want to highlight women often, but equally we want a fair crack at just straight down the middle standard historical writing.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. There's a really interesting piece in there by Margaret Macmillan, the great Margaret Macmillan, who's written about one thing. I actually got into an argument with my wife about this because she writes a 5 questions she's asked about war, and one of the questions is, if women were in charge, would you see fewer wars?
Mm.
And my wife said, absolutely, you would see fewer wars. So I used the Margaret Macmillan argument, which was, well, no, you would still see plenty of wars. But then, yeah, it descended into an argument and I shut up. So I wondered, is that, I mean, Margaret Macmillan writes books about it, like you were just saying, Miranda. She writes about, you know, subjects that are not, I mean, I guess they're more male related because it's looking at the early 1900s. Is history now in the stage that there are plenty of Margaret Macmillans out there who are writing? I mean, Catcher Hoyer one springs to mind, a recent one.
I would hope so, and I would think so, actually. Yes, but it raises all sorts of interesting questions, doesn't it, about whether one's gender affects how one writes. Is it? And I was wondering this. I was thinking about this earlier. Of course, yes. Many of us are writing traditional histories. History which is about men and women and about macro and micro, the domestic and the political. But equally, I often I find women writers, when they're tackling those traditional subjects, often masculine subjects, bring a sort of intimacy to their writing, which I really like. They look often at motivation and at relationships within that context. I mean, I'd give you an example in the case, for instance, of Antonia Fraser's biography of Oliver Cromwell, which was 50 years old now. And obviously, I know my way around the spectrum of Oliver Cromwell biographies, and hers is pretty much the only one by a woman. And it is so much more psychological, and there is so much more about his family in it than any of the other biographies written by any of the men. And is that coincidence? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that that's very interesting, and yes, I agree. There are. I mean, I came to writing historical biography uh, decades, generation almost before Miranda. So Arbella came out, my first of them came out in 2003. And at that time, in the wake of Amanda Foreman and Georgina, it was very much look for the women's story. That's what was the new commercial boom. Like all those booms, it didn't quite last. And I would love to think that that women writers now were not necessarily being steered to women's subjects. That said, of course, it is often the women's story that is the one that remains untold. So that remains a historical fact. In a sense, you are perhaps almost more likely to find one kind of holy grail, the untold story, looking at women's history.
It's funny, I was talking about researching something for a project at the moment, and I was talking to the wife of someone who is in a prominent role during a high stress period of time. And I was sort of asking her how he dealt with the stress and how it affected their home lives and things like that. And and then that prompted a whole new avenue that she had never been asked about this before. This is in the during the 1980s, but is this sort of the spouse in the past someone who, because there's no record, it's very difficult to tell, but it's such a crucial role, the spouse, that how do those stories get told if they're untold?
Well, no, indeed, that is the problem, that very often they're not recorded. And of course, then there is a whole other trap there, which is to say the spouse of, the wife of, and that's what gives this individual importance, the fact of being allied to a significant man. One would like to be able to say that in the historical world, as in reality, as in her own world, she had her own importance. It wasn't about who she was married to. But of course, realistically, yes, in terms of historical writing and publishing, crucially, it probably is.
Yes, and I think again it's about rounding out the picture, isn't it? So often it's it's a component of looking at that male figure, which has often been overlooked. And you don't necessarily need to write an entire biography of that woman. You just need to reflect upon their relationship and her role in his life when you're looking as well at him. And I find in my own work that when I'm writing, when I'm researching and writing about the family dynamics around a key individual, it sheds all sorts of light, unexpected light and perspectives on how they are behaving in their public lives.
One
Yeah.
thing I wanted to ask about was there is a tendency, and this is more obviously in fiction, for historical fiction, for writers to write about women in the past and then apply a kind of, I don't know, an interpretation that they're basically, it's almost as though they're parachuted in from 2024 or 2025. So, for example, I received some marketing material about a book from the ancient world I think in just a month ago, and it was very much, playing up the fact that this was, an untold female story. Of course, that's right to do. But do you see that there are writers who are applying today's standards to the past, and it's sort of got a bit too far?
Yes, and
Yes.
well, yes and no. And I would say from the point of view of a historical novelist, it is one of the biggest challenges about writing about women fictionally in the past is exactly that. And you're actually being pulled in two directions because your publisher, the person, people that your team behind you looking at you
Mm,
commercially want you to
mm,
give your heroines more agency because they
yeah.
want them to be that magic thing these days, which is relatable for your audience. So it's a constant tightrope between making your hero, your heroine, appealing and relatable enough that the audience will go
Mm,
along with her, but also not then allowing her, as you say, anachronistically, to have all this agency that she wouldn't have. And in my
yeah.
two novels, I found it a huge struggle, and I found it. I probably did better at that in one of them than the other. Probably my second one was a bit better at that because I'd got used to it and I'd found ways to do it. But it's a real puzzle to unlock, I think, for all of us.
Mm, yes, indeed. And I totally agree. And in non-fiction also. Again, what the publishers want is, I use exactly the same word, agency. And on the one hand, we want to restore to these women the agency, the power, the influence that we think they had, and the records have sometimes ignored or denied them. But on the other hand, we have unsalably sometimes just to admit that no, they, a medieval princess or whatever, didn't have much agency in their own lives. That's not what any reader or publisher now wants to hear, but that is another risk, another almost the opposite to what we started out talking about, the sort of male background of historical writing. This is the trap of going too far the other way.
Exactly. And if you think about how storytelling works and how narrative works, no one wants a protagonist with no agency.
Mm,
It's
mm,
just it's so hard then to write a compelling story that people will be a page turner. So you have to find a way to sort of sneakily give them agency without betraying the
mm,
true historical story too much.
mm. Agency, or at least a voice. Um, I found with my first book, Arbella, she was indeed moved around as a pawn at so many stages of her life. But luckily for me, she left these amazing letters. Often, of course, the voice has been silenced as well as the agency denied.
And exactly, and thinking about how women's voices are then treated in the past brings me back to another point that I noticed reading our anthology, Ollie, which is this idea that even when women are there in the record, so often they're traduced or they have sort of slander and libel written about them, even if they have actually, particularly if they have some agency. That's, in many historical periods and places, that was deemed dangerous and they have to then be undermined and, usually often with sort of their sexual reputations or behaviors are then attacked. So again, there's so much myth making about these
Yeah.
women as well that you need to unpick. So either they're absent from the record, or sometimes they're there, but they've been
Mm.
traduced.
Yeah, I guess actually, good point. Thinking about it, the women of the past who've been most often written about have been royal wives, royal mistresses, or witches.
Yes,
Certainly,
exactly.
certainly until the kind of last couple of hundred years of women writers and so on came in.
Yeah, it's funny because I studied ancient history and then did a lot of Greek tragedy for the degree, and so there are very powerful women in the ancient world that are written about by men in 500 BC. Antigone, for example. How do you think it's sort of evolved over time? I mean, we're talking sort of 2,500 years there, so we're not going to cover that in
Well,
now, but.
no, I guess jump to a bit more recently. Certainly in the periods about which I've often written, the Tudor late medieval, a lot of the writing, the record keeping, was done by the Victorians. A lot of it has come, the records even, have come to us through a kind of Victorian filter. So I think a lot was affected by their particular attitudes and preferences. It may be different in other periods, I don't know.
That's absolutely right. It's the same with my experience. And also when you think about that Victorian filter, particularly, again, it's very easy for people who don't really necessarily have the best understanding of historical progression, who assume that every age is more sort of sexually free and liberated than the past.
Mm.
Than the previous one. It's not necessarily the case. These things, mores come in circles, don't they, and cycle. And you might have a period that actually is freer, or with more female agency, or with looser morality, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And then actually we get to the Victorians, and it's all tightens up again. So then you have I mean, how the Victorians would write, for instance, about the Georgians, or would write about the Stuarts, again, is got its own dynamic.
Mm.
Yes, that Georgian period is, they do seem to have lived their life without any kind of shackles that are then applied during the Victorian period. It's quite a reverse. Do you think we're in that period now, where we're in a sort of a Victorian era now?
I
People
think
being cancelled left, right, and centre.
Yeah, I think to a large extent, there's certainly a very censorious sort of era, isn't it? It's an era with an awful lot of judgment and an awful lot of extremes,
Mm-hmm.
kind of in one sense, sort of extremes of liberalism and of sex and pornography and the internet, and then in other ways, kind of, as you say, huge moral viewpoints which are deemed to be, acceptable or not acceptable in a
Mm.
social setting, often by young people, which again is quite a challenge. So yeah, I think we definitely live in a very transitional time. Just it's changed. I mean, Sarah, you would have that longer perspective, as you say, but it's changed enormously, I think, even the last 10 years, 10, 15 years,
Or even less.
even less.
Of course, the other thing is that we're going into, or are in, what are very hard times, lean times for the publishing industry, for a lot of cultural organizations. And historically, that has never done any favors to telling more outsider stories. There is then a kind of homing back down to the safe bedrock, which often is not women's stories.
Absolutely. I keep having that conversation with people in our field, Sarah, that the industry is quite risk averse at the moment.
Yes, exactly that.
Right. Well, this has been a really very enjoyable chat. So I think we've kind of covered everything that we have we covered everything that we wanted to cover?
It sounds like it. I feel we're ending on rather a negative,
Well,
somber.
that's true. That is true. Oh dear.
Okay, let's
Um,
pick something nice to think about. Do you have a favorite sort of inspirational female historian or author who you've always
oh,
sort of looked up to?
I'm blowed if I'm going to pick out one. Um,
You don't have to
And
pick just one.
but I will say, no, as Miranda said, even when now you see women writing about what have been traditionally male subjects, they do it sometimes in a slightly different way, with a different set of interests and aspirations. And I do find that very inspiring.
Absolutely. And that's just the kind of writing by female women historians I particularly love, thinking about Jessie Childs, thinking about Claire Tomlin, thinking about Ruth Skur. I love anything written by Ruth Skur. I mean, a couple of books I've loved recently, Thunderclap by Laura Cumming, which was about the artist Carol Fabricius in the 1650s. And Catherine Rundell's book about John Donne, Super Infinite, was absolutely extraordinary. And again, I think had that sort of personal, psychological, poetic, empathetic approach. And maybe it's a bit rich to claim that for for our sex, Sarah, but all of the authors above
Go for it.
that approach. Yeah, why not? Yeah.
Well, I remember reading The Reason Why by Cecil Woodon Smith and loving it. I think I was about 16 or something, and I assumed it was a man. So that just sums me up, I suppose. But look, this has been lovely. Thank you very much. I'll put links to all those books that that you've just mentioned, Miranda, as well, of course, of your own. And thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. Please do get in touch if you have any thoughts on what you heard today. Links are in the show notes, but until then, thank you and good night.